Thanks so much, Lily. So yeah, I'll speak more to that key successes question. And just for context, I'm part of the Women's Major Group Secretariat. And I think that's also, and Ishan also mentioned the Women's Rights Caucus, which is more in the CSW space. The Women and Gender Constituency is also another feminist ally coalition of ours that is in the UNF Framework Convention on Climate Change space. So these also, just to ground us in that, there's also a lot of coalitions that serve as great intergenerational spaces as well. And that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from the Women's Major Group, more on the sustainable development side. But of course, we connected with the Women's Rights Caucus at the CSW. So just to start by explaining a little bit more our framing of climate justice from a feminist perspective, and just to push back a little bit on other narratives that you might hear coming up, such as the language around security or other similar framings that might be used. So in feminist spaces, both for climate justice and other spaces like feminist foreign policy spaces, we're always trying to resist a sort of militarization or securitization of the climate crisis, because this language is in some ways in direct opposition to feminist principles of care. So this is instead why we talk about climate justice. So centering the solutions on ensuring, for example, social protections and the realization of human rights, such as the right to bodily autonomy, the right to a clean and healthy environment. And we especially need to think, of course, of those most affected by the climate crisis or disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, such as women, girls, and gender diverse people in the global South. And this concept of climate justice also brings us to talk about common but differentiated responsibilities. So it is in this context where I talk about key successes for feminist civil society in terms of climate justice. So one of the biggest successes I would say is just in general this shift in bringing these conversations on climate to these gender policy spaces. Like that's already a huge success in and of itself, because it continues to build a narrative that these issues are interlinked. I'll also get into some examples from the agreed conclusions. So one of the successes is that in the agreed conclusions, we see at least a reference to loss and damage. And it says like reiterating the urgency of scaling up action and finance for developing countries who are most vulnerable. So when we talk about loss and damage, we mean understanding that some of the impacts of climate change are beyond the point of what could be mitigated or adapted to. So those two main pillars of climate action, mitigation and adaptation. And instead we're proposing also this loss and damage pillar, because this is one that's especially affecting frontline communities in the global South. And you might be asking yourself, why is loss and damage so important? Like, why is it a gender equality issue? And of course, because women, girls, and gender diverse people are disproportionately impacted by loss and damage. And they're also at the front line of the solutions that we need. And they're the ones really doing the care work, as we know, in all of these situations. So that's a main issue that we're happy to see was mentioned in the agreed conclusions. We're also happy to see a heading in the agreed conclusions on fostering a gender responsive and just transition. We usually actually use framing of just and equitable transition to ensure that there is gender equality and also social justice principles within the concept of just transition, which comes more from labor movements. But we're happy to see the word gender responsive when speaking of just transition, because this sets precedent to talking about gendered realities. Again, care work and care jobs specifically, and this intersection between care and climate. We also are happy to see that SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, are mentioned several times in the agreed conclusions of CSW. And especially because SRHR is mentioned in the context of climate. So linking it to climate impacts was also a big win, because it sets the precedent for also talking about bodily autonomy in the context of climate change, disaster, risk reduction, and beyond. So yeah, those are some examples of some key successes from CSW 66.